Most of the 20th century has been quite unkind to Hungary. It's been largely ignored by other nations except those with grievances against Hungarians. It joined two disastrous wars on the wrong side. It staggered through the first 5 decades with scant attention from the rest of the world. Not even the giant catastrophe of the Trianon Treaty, which haunted my childhood, was much of a talked about affair, even in Margaret Macmillan's celebrated book, Paris 1919. It rates but a footnote. It was not viewed as a big thing. In 1945, the country became part of the Soviet Empire, or shortly after 1945, with the invasion of the Soviet troops, or as Hungarian small children, you learned it was our liberation. My family used to joke that the Russians had liberated us from whatever we had left after the Germans had gone home. Now, life after the Russians came in was particularly harsh for those families that had enjoyed some prominence prior to the invasion. As you heard, I was born here. Already in 1945, my father was taken off to Malyanki Robot in Siberia. My grandfather spent 2 years in a forced labor camp called, those of you who are Hungarian might have heard of Recsk. That's where he was. My mother spent only a year in jail because she tried to get out of the country, and as some of you will know, that was frowned upon by the authorities. In 1956, and I remember 1956, although I should like to pretend that I was only 2, but in fact I was a little older, we were the news. Hungary was the news. We were the heroes in a battle against a foe we had shared with the Western powers. This was a first. As I said, we were on the wrong side, usually. NBC was here, CBS, actually, I remember the cameras running around, and I remember the tanks, and I remember one Russian soldier who died right next to me. He was he was 19 years old. He seemed to think he was somewhere else, because we all learned Russian in those days at school. I could understand him reasonably well. 200,000 Hungarians left, I'm told, give or take, and my mother took me out at the same time. Canada, which is where I live, accepted more Hungarian refugees per capita than any other country. We took in 37,000 in 1 year, without visas, medical exams, without ID papers, without anything, with no questions asked. I think that what I'd like to just talk about briefly is the Hungarian contribution to Canada, because nobody else is going to do that. I'm the only one here from that country. I'd like to start by talking briefly about the Sopron foresters. Sopron, for those of you who don't know, is to the west of here, and it used to have a very famous forestry school. For all I know, it may still have a forestry school, but the entire student body plus faculty left in '56 and went eventually to Canada. That's 300 people. What they did, in addition to trying to get adjusted to living in log cabins, not a mode of habitation in Hungary, and working as loggers in Canadian western forests, where a single tree would be approximately as big as 100 trees in and around Sopron, was they succeeded in making a new life for themselves. They also, subsequent to graduation, they learned the language, they did all those good things, and subsequent to graduation, they actually changed the way forestry is practiced in North America. The people who ran forestry undertakings in both my country, Canada, and in the United States are from Sopron, and they're the 56ers. Entrepreneurs, and I'll only mention one, Frank Hasenfratz, who is a Hungarian refugee, 56er, arrived with nothing. Well, he got $5 upon arrival. That's all he got there with. He spent his first few weeks sleeping on a bench in a railway station. He was looking for a job during the day, and he's sleeping on the bench during the night. He eventually he went to work in a machine shop, eventually got his own machine shop, and he's now the founder of a company called Linamar. Linamar employs more than 20,000 people, and he is personally a billionaire and has recently handed over the running of Linamar, how am I doing, to his daughter, who is incredibly bright. She's, I've met her several times. She's very, very bright, but she's also substantially more beautiful than her father, which I gather is not a bad thing in business. Tom Michalik has also arrived with nothing. Tom now has a series of clothing stores in Canada, very good, men's clothing mostly, and cut rate. So for those of you who are interested in business stories, I'll only give you two. I could do more, but running out of time. Frank Falkai was one of the Pestry Strats, young guy, like Mr. Valaloy was talking about. He was a parliamentarian in Canada. I would like to talk for a few minutes about writers, because I'm in the words business. I've been a publisher, and I've written a number of books, more than what was mentioned, but the introductions have to run out of time as well. I think writers are terribly important because they actually create identity for the country in which they live. They have a way of projecting not only the past, but also the future. In the case of Canada, because it's a young country with an enormous amount of geography and very little history, the writers who came from here have had perhaps more influence than they might have had they stayed here, where history is uppermost and there's not much geography. My family used to have, the Trianon Treaty was defined by my family as a little children's poem about Hungary was a big country, now it's a little country. Those of you who are Hungarian probably know the poem. It ends with, bad guys have come and robbed us of it. Anyway, in Canada would be hard to rob because it's just huge. I'll mention a few of the writers. George Jonas, who I'm mentioning George because, of course, his books have also been published here. But in addition to his books, he made 200 television documentaries, plus radio documentaries. He was a columnist. He was the author of the books I've mentioned, but the two that you might know, one of them is Vengeance, about the Mossad mission to avenge the murder of the 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, and Beethoven's Mask. Both of these have been published here. He wrote poetry as well. He wrote a little poem about arriving in Canada, And it goes like this: with cardboard trunks, torn clothes, needing a wash, an evil-smelling strange boy, tall and thin, had asked to spend the night, and God knows why, they took me in. Stephen Vizince, some of you may have heard of Stephen Vizince, who wrote a wonderful book called In Praise of All the Women. When I first read it, sold 8 million copies. When I first read that book, actually I thought it's nonsense, but now, In Praise of All the Women, seems like an absolute natural. His second book, The Innocent Millionaire, did approximately as well. Graham Greene mentioned that Stephen Vizince could teach the English how to write. I kind of like that. George Faludi. My mother used to love George Faludi because he translated the little-known 15th century French poet François Villon into Hungarian and made him into a national bestseller. Not something that François Villon was back in France, but here, this was the biggest poetry thing you could ever hear of. Seriously, I'm not making this up. He's also the author of a wonderful book called My Happy Days in Hell. George Faludi was an equal opportunities prisoner in that he had served hard time in both Nazi and communist prisons. One of his he's not the only one I know, there's others here, but I was always impressed by that. He wasn't given a pen or a piece of paper, but one of his fellow prisoners, who also ended up, oddly enough, in Canada, memorized all the poems that Faludi wrote while in prison. So when he came out, finally, that poetry could be published. Now, at some point, George came back here. It's difficult to be a Hungarian writer in a country where your language is not spoken. So storytellers, some of you may have heard of Robert Lantos, co-founder of Alliance Communications, multiple award-winning movie producer, 2015 winner of the Media Production Association, so we're on and on our future films. His film, thank you, Taste of Sunshine, which was actually, it was shown here, it won a Hungarian award, I can't remember which one. Joshua Then and Now, Fugitive Pieces, and with István Szabó also, Mordecai Richter's Barney's version. Laszlo Barna, whose television films you can actually watch here, because it's amazing how many Canadian-made television series are on here and how beautifully all those people speak Hungarian. I had my TV on saying, my God, that guy. I didn't know he could speak Hungarian. Well, they don't, of course, it's dubbed. Richard Teleki, third generation Canadian, and I wanted to mention him and a couple of the others that I'm going to go on in 2 minutes, because an interesting thing has happened to second and third generation Hungarians in Canada. They're born there, their parents were often born there, but they have developed an uncanny interest in Hungary and things Hungarian and Hungarian history. Richard Teleki is no exception. He learned Hungarian as a second language. He's a poet, he's a writer. His book, Hungarian Rhapsodies, has been translated into Hungarian, as have some of his other books. George Sipos, another one, couldn't speak a word of Hungarian, learned the language. Poet now, you know. Tamás Dobozy, his book, Siege 13, about the siege of Budapest. It's amazing. I mean, the guy writes about the siege of Budapest. He wasn't born here. And there are many others, and they help for us, Canadians, they help define, I think, who we are. And I have a footnote in my last 1 minute. I think one of the interesting sidelines for Canadians about 1956 is that Yuri Andropov, as I think somebody mentioned, was here, and he was shocked and horrified. Yuri Andropov, as many of you know, was leader of the Soviet Union for a few years. He was a patron of Gorbachev. He ordered the Soviet troops into Hungary in 56, and he ended up much beloved Soviet ambassador, Russian ambassador to Canada. I traveled all over Central and Eastern Europe writing a book called Ghosts of Europe, and I was quite amazed at how many national leaders thought that the Hungarian Revolution was extraordinary. When I went into this now somewhat mean office occupied by former General Jaruzelski in Warsaw, the first thing he did was he hugged me and he said, "Polski, Hungarski brothers," which I thought was kind of nice. I mean, you know, if you don't like him, I didn't like him, but it was still nice. And then he went on in Polish about how the Hungarians in 56 were presaged the much greater events in Poland. In Poland, everything is greater than in Hungary. When I met Václav Havel in Prague, he said that he and his fellow dissidents had been inspired by what happened in Hungary in 56, which I thought was very nice. And Joseph Skoretsky, a great Czech writer whom I had the privilege of publishing for a number of years, he said at our first meeting that he has always been predisposed not to like Hungarians because the Czech version of history is a little different from ours. But in my case, he would make an exception because of 56. Mr. Fico, who I think is still hanging around over there in Slovakia, did mention that he has still had a desire to run a couple of tanks across the border and shoot up the Hungarian parliament, but he had some respect for 56ers. And I think, had I not been born here and been through 56, writing that book and meeting those people would have been vastly more difficult. Thank you.